As we get into Module 13, we're going to be talking about all different kinds of invertebrates. Now, invertebrates are animals that do not have a backbone. And so you might initially think that there really aren't very many invertebrates because almost every animal that we are aware of does have a backbone to it. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my, and dogs and cats and almost any type of animal, the birds that we see, they all have backbones. But there are actually more invertebrates in our world than there are vertebrates. There are a vast number of invertebrates. And so we're going to spend this chapter talking about certain invertebrates and looking at different characteristics that they have. The first characteristic that we're going to talk about, though, is symmetry. And it is a characteristic of the body type of any type of animal that we're going to talk about. When we talk about symmetry, what we're talking about is if we would take an animal and can we cut it in a certain way so that I have two identical halves. Now, you can see that your book talks about it and they show you some pictures, but sometimes it's easier to see things in 3 dimensions. And so even though I realize that you're viewing this on a flat screen, hopefully some of the 3-dimensional objects I use will help you to understand what symmetry is really all about. Now, when we think of cutting an object in half, probably the easiest way to think about it is if you would take like a big meat cleaver or a machete, something with a really huge blade. Even if you had something like a big cookie sheet and you take that and you drive it down the center to really cleave it in half into 2 even halves. Okay, so when we think of cutting it in half, that's what we're thinking about. Now, there are some creatures that don't have any symmetry at all. In fact, the very first creatures that we talk about in this module are going to be sponges. Not the sponge that you clean with, but the sponge that's an animal. And those creatures actually don't have any symmetry. There's no way to cut them in half so that you have 2 halves that look the same to each other. So not all animals have symmetry, although most of them do have some type of symmetry. So if an animal doesn't have any symmetry, I mean, that's an option, but they might have something called spherical symmetry. And if you have spherical symmetry, you can cut this creature in any direction as long as it goes through the center, and you will have 2 identical halves. So the easiest way to visualize this is with now in America, we call this a soccer ball. I know a lot of you are in countries where they call this a football. Whatever you call it, it is round, it is a sphere. And so if I would take my big, huge blade and I could cut this in half this way, I could cut it this way, I could cut it at an angle, I could cut it this way, as long as I go through the very center of the ball. Like if you imagine the very center point in the center of the ball, if I stick my finger all the way through it and touch that very center, as long as I cut through that center point, I'm going to have 2 identical halves of a ball. Now, for some of you perfectionists out there, you're going to say, no, Mrs. Thompson, if you drive a blade through that ball, you're going to have a deflated ball. Okay, well, we're going to pretend that this is solid. And so if I would cut it and it would stay inflated, then I would have 2 identical halves. Now, just because this is spherical and has spherical symmetry, it doesn't mean that everything that has spherical symmetry has to be a sphere. I could have an object like an American football. Now, when we talk about this one, we're going to have to imagine for a minute that the laces are not here. If you have a dad or a brother, or if you really like to watch American football, you understand that the laces on this football are hugely important as far as aerodynamics, and obviously the quarterback's going to know where the laces are, the kickers are going to know where the laces are because they're very important in how you are going to manipulate this football. But for our purposes, we're going to pretend that these laces are not here. Okay, so when you look at this football, if I, again, would take my blade and I would cut it, I could take it and I could cut it down this way. I could cut it across this way. I could cut it down at an angle. And as long as I go through that very center point in the middle of the football, I'm going to have 2 identical halves. So this also has spherical symmetry because I can cut it in any direction and I'm still going to have 2 identical halves. Another example of an object that has spherical symmetry would be a can. I can take this, I can cut it down this way, I can cut it across this way, I can cut it diagonally this way, and as long as I go through the very center of the can, I have two identical halves. So even though we think of a can as having a top and a bottom, I mean, really, I could flip this either direction and it looks the same. It's not like I have a distinguishable top and bottom. So any object or any creature that has spherical symmetry is really not going to have a top or a bottom. They're not going to have a front or a back. So you're going to be able to cut it in any direction as long as you go through the center. Now, that's a little bit different than something that's going to have radial symmetry. If it has radial symmetry, I'm only going to be able to make a longitudinal cut, which means I'm going to cut from top to bottom. An object like this doesn't have a front or a back. So an example of something that has radial symmetry would be a drinking glass. Okay, obviously there's a top and a bottom because the top is open and the bottom is not. So if you cut it this way, you obviously do not have two identical halves because this top is going to have, it's going to be open on both sides and this is going to be closed on one side. So I can't cut a glass this way and expect it to have symmetry. The only way I can cut this is to go from top to bottom. Now, I can cut it going this direction. I can cut it going this direction. I can cut it going this direction. So, there's 360 degrees in a circle. I can turn this blade almost any way I want to, cut it straight down, and I'll have two identical halves as long as I go through the middle, okay? But I have to go from top to bottom. I can't go any other direction. Another example of a common household item that would have radial symmetry would be a pie plate. Now, if I had a pie in here, it would still have radial symmetry because I could cut that pie, again, I could cut it this direction, I could cut it this direction, I could cut it this direction, I can cut it any number of directions going this way. The way I cannot cut it is to go this way. Can you imagine cutting a blackberry pie this direction? Somebody has all the crust, somebody has all the berries. That doesn't sound like a very equitable way to cut a pie to me. I wouldn't want my pie cut that way. But when you cut it, you can cut it any number of directions as long as you go from top to bottom. So an object with radial symmetry has top and a bottom, but it doesn't have a front and a back. Now, most of the creatures that we are aware of have bilateral symmetry. And so what that means is that you can only make one longitudinal cut. So again, from top to bottom, there's only one cut that's possible. So people have bilateral symmetry because there's only one cut I can make. If I was going to cut this doll in half, then I would have to cut this direction from top to bottom right down the middle, okay? Because then I have two halves that look the same. Now, you can't be a diehard about this. I don't know if you've ever done that kind of an art project where you take a picture of your face and you cut it in half and then you try to put two of the right halves together and your face looks really funny because our two sides are not exactly mirror images of each other. And if you think what's on the inside of us, I have a liver that's more to one side and my heart is more to one side and one of my lungs is actually a little bit bigger than the other one. So you can't be a diehard about this, but in general, you're going to have, just by appearance, you're going to have two halves that look very, very similar to each other by making one longitudinal cut down the middle. Okay, so three types of symmetry. Of course, you can have no symmetry. Spherical symmetry means there's no top or bottom, there's no front or back, and I can cut in any direction as long as I get the object in half. Radial symmetry means I have to make a longitudinal cut. There is a top and a bottom, but there's no front or back. And then bilateral symmetry means there's only one cut possible. So in your assignment today, I've actually given you some other pictures so you can practice determining which kind of symmetry these different creatures are going to have. Now, as we move forward into this module, we're going to be studying a number of different phyla of animals. Now, if you remember phyla, remember we start with domain, then we go to kingdom, and then we go to phyla. So a phyla is a rather large grouping of animals. And what you're going to be expected to know is the general characteristics of each one of these phyla. For example, we're going to be talking about circulatory systems. We're going to be talking about digestive systems. And when we talk about circulatory systems, there's a couple of different kinds. There's an open type and there's a closed type. So what are the differences between those two types of circulatory systems? And what type of circulatory system does each phyla have? We're going to talk about digestive systems. There's some animals have a gastrovascular cavity and some of them have a closed digestive system. What's the difference between those two systems, and which phyla have which kind of system in them? What kind of nervous systems do they have? As far as nitty-gritty details of anatomy, there's only one animal that you're going to be expected to know a lot of detail, where you're actually going to be asked to label a diagram of the internal organs of that animal, and that's the earthworm. And so we'll spend several days working on earthworms and really trying to understand how everything fits together, how the different systems work, how it's organized within the body. That will be the one dissection that we do. If you have a dissection kit and specimens, then we will start dissections here, and we will start with the earthworm. So you will also notice that I have given you links to a lot of videos. I live in landlocked Indiana, and so I don't have access to a lot of the sea creatures that we're going to be talking about, but I really think that a good way for you to appreciate the diverse ways that God has created all of these creatures is for you actually to be able to see them. And so I've linked you to a lot of videos. I've been very careful to try to make sure that the videos don't have a whole lot of evolutionary references to them, and so they have been specially picked for you so that you don't have to listen to all that stuff as well, because we want to glorify our Creator as we're going through all of this. So lots of videos coming up, lots of coloring sheets to help you understand the different types of phyla and the differences between them. So I hope you enjoy this chapter on invertebrates.